Hello everyone, Professor Herbst here, week 4, lecture 3. Sorry I can't be there in person, so let me offer this video lecture and begin thinking back to where we started in the period of the 1st century. And if we go back to the start of that 1st century, we have Augustus as the emperor and entering into this period known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which lasts for the better part of 2 centuries, and it comes to the end at the late 2nd century when Rome begins to feel greater pressures on its frontiers. There are some demographic challenges. There's a plague known as the Antonine Plague that strikes the empire in the second half of the 20th century. So we see these challenges, and as we move to the end of the 2nd century and into the beginning of the 3rd century, we see the emergence of this emperor from the military named Septimius Severus, and you see him listed there on that map. You could see him, and there's an image of him at the top left there. And Septimius Severus is an emperor from Africa, and you can see by this time their emperors are no longer coming from Italy. And Septimius Severus will establish a dynasty that will last for 4 decades. And to secure his power, he made 2 important changes. First, he gave soldiers a 100% salary increase, which was the first pay raise in a century for the Roman soldiers. And service is voluntary at this time, and so that helps to incentivize enrollment in the military. And he also allows soldiers to marry, which they had been officially barred from doing up until that time. So with the loyalty of his army and with his sons, he fought the Persians, and he celebrated a great victory. And you see that triumphal arch, which I have for you at the top right, which is in Rome, and that's the Arch of Septimius Severus. And to secure his position, he married Julia Domna. You see her at right there, and just below Septimius Severus at left, there you see the emperor with his wife Julia Domna. She's from a very wealthy Syrian aristocratic family, and so the Severan dynasty is an African Syrian dynasty. And Severus then passed power to his sons Geta and Caracalla and left them with this advice: enrich the army, keep peace with each other, and to hell with the rest. So looking at this map, you see where emperors came from in the Roman Empire, and you'll notice that emperors no longer came from Italy. By the end of the 2nd century, you'll see Trajan and Hadrian came from Spain, and then Septimius Severus here at the end of the 2nd century from Africa, son Caracalla from Africa, and they married, Septimius Severus married Julia Domna, so you'll see those Syrians, Elagabalus, Alexander Severus, all related to Severus and that dynasty. And I'll just highlight here, if you look to the Balkans, where you'll see Carus and Probus and Diocletian and Claudius and Decius, that's going to tell us that there's something about the Balkans that is particularly important for Rome at this time, and I'll come back to that later, particularly next week. And it's during Septimius Severus's reign that we see persecutions of Christians. One example of a persecution during the reign of Septimius Severus is that of Vibia Perpetua. And you'll see the assigned reading on Perpetua and Felicity, and it's a fascinating reading. Perpetua is a catechumen. She's a young mother. She's 22 years old. She's arrested. Catechumen meaning someone who is being instructed to be baptized as a Christian, when she's arrested with others, including Felicity, who is a slave. And the reading is fascinating because we hear the voice of Perpetua herself. This is an account of her martyrdom that's obviously written after her death, but it includes her own voice because she kept a diary, and the diary is used. So you'll see in the reading it shifts from a 3rd person talking about Perpetua, and then you see it shifts into the 1st person, I. And it's a remarkable document as you see everything that was going on. Her worries about her child that she's nursing at her breast, her father that is pleading with her to turn away from Christianity because he so desperately does not want to see his daughter be killed. You'll see even the governor trying to get Perpetua to look at her fathers, look at the gray hairs of the fathers, and to why is she standing with Christianity? Is she going to lose everything? And of course, she stands fast, and then you'll see her vision. So it's kind of remarkable. You see these visions that she has. They are dramatically vivid, as you'll see. And I'll leave that for you to have a look at the charismatic power that we have here in Perpetua. And so given these turn of events, it's not surprising that a fellow North African, Tertullian, would write an apology for Christianity. After all, this is what they are experiencing, and this was written just before the martyrdom of Perpetua. And in it, again, he exposes the injustice of the Roman legal practice that is coming after Christians when they haven't committed any crime. So he addresses the various accusations that we've talked about in our course. He'll highlight the virtues of Christians against a lack of virtues he'll emphasize among pagan traditions. And he will point to Christians' willingness to undergo persecution, as we see in the case of Perpetua, as evidence of the strength of the faith, as evidence of its truth. And famously, he says in his Apologia that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. The Roman effort to eliminate Christianity by persecuting and killing Christians has the very opposite effect, as it ends up promoting the very truth of the faith. At least that's the argument of Tertullian. The faith grows by persecution, despite the Roman effort. Now, shifting back to the political sphere, we see the continuation of the Severan dynasty as Septimius Severus's rule passes to that of his son Caracalla. And remember Septimius Severus's advice to his son. Well, Caracalla heeded two parts of the three. He certainly enriched the army, and he certainly cared about no one else, but instead of keeping peace with his brother, he killed him. And so that's why you see in that image at left, his brother Gaeta's face has been damned and erased. And we have examples of him trying to wipe out the memory of his co-ruler and brother. So this is Caracalla. I bring him up here because he did something in 212, which is important. This is in Roman history. It has some impact on Christianity, although I won't emphasize that. But it's in his decree called the Antonine Constitution. This is a law in 212. He granted Roman citizenship to every freeborn person in the empire. So for all those who were not slaves, they suddenly became Romans, whether they were in Britain or in Syria, North Africa, or anywhere else. We now have an empire of Roman citizens. After the Severan dynasty comes to an end in 235, let me move forward here to the reign of Philip, who in the year 248, on April 21st, he presided over a massive public celebration marking the 1000th anniversary of the city of Rome, which they viewed as founded on April 21st, 753 BCE by our reckoning, and it was founded by a figure named Romulus. And so you see this coin here of Philip commemorating that very celebration, which included processions and extravagant games and theatrical performances, and the city reveled in its own history and its longevity, something that Augustine of Hippo will be discussing later, and I'll bring that up in a few weeks. The clouds, of course, were gathering on the horizons, making the future of the city and the empire in grave danger, because Philip will be assassinated, and then we will enter a period of prolonged and continuous civil war, known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. And it's in this period, while we have generals fighting one another, we also see invasions from the outside. So in the 3rd century, we see Germanic groups crossing the frontiers and invading the empire in Gaul and into Italy, and in the Balkans we see the Goths. And at the same time, from the east, if you look at this map, we also see incursions from the Persian Empire. And we have this powerful new dynasty known as the Sasanian dynasty that happens to come to power in the 3rd century, precisely at this time, which begins incursions into Syria, into the Roman Empire. And it's so effective, in fact, it not only defeats Roman emperors, it will imprison and kill emperors. And participating in this period will be those generals from the Balkans fighting one another. And why the Balkans is because at this time, the Balkan provinces are where the troops are heavily recruited from. So we have troops recruited from the Balkans who rise up to become generals, and now they are fighting to become emperors in this crisis of the 3rd century period. And one of those emperors, if you see Decius at the very northernmost stretch region here of the Danube, it is Decius who begins empire-wide persecution. So again, if you think about what's going on here, we have an empire that is experiencing sort of almost unprecedented challenge of invasions and civil war, and there's economic problems that are related to all of this, and they're seeking for a solution. So Decius wants all citizens in the empire to sacrifice to the gods, demonstrate piety, so we can ensure the peace of the gods, the pax deorum, because the gods want us to give them their proper due. And who, of course, is out there that they're aware of that is not doing it? They are the Christians. So you need to sacrifice to get a libellus, and there's an image of one at right. This is going to be a certification that you're a good citizen, you have sacrificed, you have demonstrated proper piety. You'll get a copy. There'll be a copy placed with the government authorities, and those that will not do the sacrifice will be killed. And this is how Origen of Alexandria is arrested and tortured, and we've seen that already. It's in this period, the crisis of the 3rd century, empire-wide persecution begins with Decius. So that's all the background that we need to understand Cyprian of Carthage and his period and his impact. Cyprian was a pagan. He converts to Christianity as an adult. He's about 40 years old when he converts. He had been a lawyer. And then he soon becomes bishop. He's so influential in the community. And we know much about Cyprian thanks to the many letters that he wrote that are preserved, as well as the treatises that he wrote on various issues and challenges of his day. Now, as the Decian persecution reached North Africa, Cyprian opted to go into hiding. Now, he did so not because he feared death, as we'll see later in his life when he is executed and martyred, but because he saw the damage that communities faced when they lost their leaders. So he felt it was more important to continue his leadership role, but do so from hiding. At the conclusion of the persecution, he returned to Carthage. And when he returned, he sought to restore unity, and there was great division in the church over those who had lapsed, and that is, they had performed the sacrifice in order to survive, and then those who were confessors, those who underwent torture for the faith, and now were viewed by many as truly holy, were the lapsed, of course, were those who did not say true to the faith. And the challenge here was something I brought up in class. Who should forgive the lapsed? Who has a right to forgive, and who has the right to give penance? That is, decide what the lapsed should do in order to be fully received back into the church. Many people in Carthage thought it was the confessors, that they had now reached a certain level of holiness, that these people had the power to pass judgment on the lapsed or to grant forgiveness. Cyprian now is faced with this challenge. He'll write a treatise on the lapsed. He'll write a treatise on the unity of the church because he sees the challenge here, that this is something that could break the church apart. And his leadership goal is to keep it together. So let me say a few words about this treatise on the unity of the church, which he compares with the seamless cloak of Christ, which is referenced in the Gospel of John, chapter 19. Cyprian stresses that the church is one, it's visible, it's unified, it cannot be divided. There are those outside the church that are separated from it, and then there is the church within. And so you can break off from it, but there is only one church. As Cyprian asserted, and I quote, "He can no longer have God for a father who has not the church for a mother." So salvation is dependent upon being in the church. So if you break away from it, your very soul is at stake, according to Cyprian in this argument. So for purposes of this unity, holding things together, he points to the importance of the leadership of Rome. And he cites from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verse 18. I use a different translation here. And this is from the reading that I assigned you for this lecture. "The Lord speaks to Peter. I say unto thee," he says, "that thou art Peter. And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound also in heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." So Cyprian is pointing to this gospel verse, pointing to this passage, Jesus speaking to the apostle Peter, and the important role of Peter that we see in the Gospels. And for Cyprian, of course, Peter making his way to Rome, as Cyprian understands it, Peter being the first bishop of Rome, and Rome then playing this pivotal role in the unity of the church, with all of the bishops participating in that unity together. But we see here Rome highlighted for its particularly important role in leadership, at least in this treatise. Now later, Cyprian is going to get into conflict with another bishop. This is Stephen, Bishop of Rome, or Pope Stephen, and the conflict is over whether baptism should be accepted if you had been baptized by groups that broke away from the church. So this brings up this question of who can baptize and who can be baptized. Now we've read in the Didache, and we read in the passages from the apologist Justin Martyr talking about baptism, and in those cases we're talking about adults being baptized by leaders in the church community. And what about babies? Now, if we look at Acts of the Apostles, we go to the New Testament, chapter 16 and chapter 18, you see cases where we see whole households are baptized. And there are those that would say, well, among the household will be babies. And there were those that would say, well, it doesn't say it, so it didn't happen. So again, there's this dispute among contemporary Christian communities as how to understand that. So the question for us then is how we see as the church is expanding, as you have these converts coming in, what happens when you have Christian families have babies? And how are they going to raise those children? And what is the role or the ritual by which those children will enter into this Christian community? So we see in North Africa, in the 3rd century, we already see evidence, we see clear evidence of infant baptism at that point. Tertullian does write a treatise on baptism. Tertullian advocates for delaying baptism, again, thinking about the role of baptism and the forgiveness of sin. But by Cyprian's time, we see that the baptism of babies was becoming more common, and Augustine of Hippo, also North African, so all three, Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine, and we could bring Perpetua earlier, these are all North African Christians. Augustine will advocate for the importance of the baptism of children and the role of grace that is present through that ritual. That's something we can talk about later. But in this case, we have this argument over the acceptance of baptism by communities that were in schism, that had broken from the church. Now, those communities may have baptized in a way that was correct, and that was the dispute. So Cyprian wanted to rebaptize those communities where the Bishop of Rome was advocating if that baptism was performed correctly, there is no need to do a rebaptism because baptism can only occur once. So you have this dispute between Cyprian and Rome. In this case, Cyprian turns against the Bishop of Rome, although his position ultimately would not prevail. Now, Cyprian is also important because of the letters that he wrote and a treatise that he wrote on mortality here in the 3rd century. And because of those letters and because of the image that we get of the Roman Empire and the Christian response to the plague that is striking the empire in the 3rd century, the plague is often known as the plague of Cyprian only because he's such an important source. And it's quite interesting because we can see the Christian response in his letters. So the response of compassion and care and assisting fellow Christians and non-Christians who are stricken by the plague. And you can see the role of philanthropy in the Christian community, and it's important for winning converts. So not only we have at the start of this lecture, we have martyrs being the seed of the church. Now we see this social role of Christians assisting both Christians and non-Christians, and how that also becomes a way that people enter the community. And it's because of these letters we see the great extent of Christian philanthropy as the church, as it's growing, is taking care of the needy, taking care of widows. And we can see the impact of Christian philanthropy and its extent here in the 3rd century. Now, Cyprian will be killed in the empire-wide persecution of Valerian. So we have something called the Acts of Cyprian, and you can see that. So again, if you think earlier in this talk, we see that he went into hiding at the persecution of Decius. And he did so because he wanted to continue to try to offer leadership to the church, even in exile. And then during the reign of Valerian, he is arrested and he stands trial and stands true to the faith, and he is executed under Valerian. And after that, however, Valerian is one of those emperors that is killed by the Persians, the Sasanian dynasty. And after that, from 260 on, for the rest of the 3rd century, the church experiences a prolonged period of peace. So from Cyprian's age on, as we move into the 260s, 270s, 280s, 290s, the church experiences peace in the empire. And what we see, thanks to that period of martyrdom, thanks to the philanthropic efforts, the number of Christians significantly increases in the 3rd century. And the century is going to be brought to conclusion by yet another Balkan emperor. His name is Diocletian. He's a remarkable figure in the Roman Empire. The Emperor Diocletian will restore order to the Roman Empire, secure its borders, bring internal peace, put an end to the civil war, seek to restore economic security. But Diocletian is also remembered as the last persecutor. And that story we'll turn to next week. Have a good weekend, everyone. Professor Herbst signing off.